Hello, and happy St. Patrick's Day, and welcome back to the Masonic Roundtable, a weekly program where Masons from around the world get together to talk about Masonic news and opinions in a friendly and social manner. As a reminder, the thoughts and opinions expressed here are solely the opinions of the participants and do not represent any Grand Lodge statements or positions. Make sure you keep your conversations open for the public and on the level. To interact with us, you can join us every Thursday night. We are streaming live on Facebook, YouTube. Love hanging out with you in the chats, and we love to see what you come up with regarding every week's topic. So, you know me. My name is John Ruark. I'm a past master of the Patriot Lodge, number 1957, in Fairfax, Virginia. And next up, who do we have? We have Joe Martinez. Hello, Joe.
Hello. My
Hello.
name is Joe Martinez. When John decides to press the button. Yeah.
Bam!
There it is. Boom. Hi, Joe Martinez. I am not a Jacobite, but I am a Freemason. And this week, I am master of Manassas Lodge number 182 in Manassas, Virginia, and member of a bunch of other things, and excited to talk about some history tonight. So let's do that.
Let's do that. Awesome.
Let's
Next up, Jason Richards. Good evening.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Jason Richards here, past master of Acacia Lodge number 16 in Clifton, Virginia, member of lodges in DC and Ohio as well.
Sweet. Awesome. I know RJ's on his way, so we'll get right to it. But we do want to give a special shout out to the patrons who've been supporting the show. You guys are awesome. Keep getting new guys coming into our little private Facebook group and throwing lots of knowledge bombs in there this week. Some new members talking about PA Masonry, talking about the show notes from last week. So if you want in on that fun, love to see you over there. Head on over to patreon.com/the Masonic Roundtable and chip in a few bucks, and that way we can keep the show going for many, many years to come. So thank you already for your support.
And buy John new cool hats.
Yes. This was not a TMR acquisition, but there might be more hats in the future. We'll see.
Ooh. I do like hats. I like them.
Yes. Almost as much as skulls. Almost.
Oh, maybe a little bit more.
Oh.
Because, Joe is, this is where he's working at in the hair department. So he has to, accent the head in some other way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
We can't all have wonderful hair like Jason.
Look at that glorious, glorious locks. Wisping away. I do remember COVID hair, Jason, for like the first 6 months.
Do we have a picture of that? Yeah, do we have a picture of that? We should whip that out.
Go to the archives.
That was good hair, man.
It was the birth of my great new haircut. Like
the whole flock of seagulls thing.
We were posting. No, it wasn't flock of seagulls. We were posting pictures
Korg.
of
or not Korg.
Yeah,
Zorg
from the Fifth Element. Yeah.
Yes. Hello, my name is Korg. I'm made of rocks, as you can see.
Moving along. So this week's topic.
The revolution has begun.
This week's topic is about Jacobitism, which is an interesting term that you don't hear much about in Freemasonry, and yet we may find out a little bit about history tonight where the linkage between the Protestants versus the Catholics, the true heir of the crown of the King of England, the revolutions that were going on. There's so many plot lines twisted in here. You think you're watching a Marvel multiverse, but no, you're learning about Jacobitism and Freemasonry. Mm-hmm. So I have to admit, when we were getting ready for the show, I knew next to nothing about this topic, and we were typing in our little chat amongst the hosts, man, there's just so many rabbit holes you could go down as you explore what was going on in Europe at this time frame, right as the premier Grand Lodge of England was getting started. You're talking about murder and betrayal, and there's just so much to cover. We won't be able to cover it all, but we're going to do our best to talk about how Masonry may or may not have been influenced by the Jacobite revolution. So, Jason, tell us about where does this term Jacobite come from? What is it all about? And then really, how does this set up the stage for the European theater at this time frame?
Tell us, Jason.
So the word Jacobite actually comes from Jacobus, which I read Wikipedia and totally forgot what it means.
James. Latin for
We're off
James.
to a
There we go.
great start. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I study, not necessarily the movement itself. So the Jacobite comes from the Latin Jacobus for James, and it was essentially a movement that was designed to reinstitute the true Catholic heir over essentially Ireland and not Ireland, sorry, England and Scotland. And so to understand where this is coming from, we need to go back to 17 when Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses on the door of the church and kicks off the Protestant Reformation. So, Protestant Reformation sweeps through Europe. The Catholic Church at the time had been very much associated with political power, and there were certain practices like the sale of indulgences, which Martin Luther fought against, and he sought to, reform the church, not cause a revolution and a fracturing of the church, but ultimately Protestantism began to make waves throughout Europe in the early to mid 16th century, arriving in Scotland with the Scottish Reformation in about 1560, 1566. Scotland was very heavily Catholic, and if you know anything about the stonemasons guilds in Scotland, the stonemasons were very heavily Catholic because they relied on the Catholic Church for
For
their
work.
charters and for their work.
Right.
That's right. Um, as of the 11 and 1200s, the Catholic Church owned an estimated half or so of the entire landmass of Scotland. And so there's a long history within stonemasonry of loyalty to the Catholic Church. The Scottish Reformation comes in the 1560s. There is a fierce backlash against Catholic edifices, and raiders from the British Isles, didn't help this by coming in and razing cathedrals and destroying abbey records. This is why up until the really 1598, we just don't have any paper records of stonemasonry, and it wasn't until the then King of Scotland and England, James VI in Scotland, James I in England, who gives us the King James version of the Bible, installed William Shaw as the master of work over the stonemasons in Scotland, and really forced the stonemasons to start keeping minutes and records. And so James really comes in and standardizes the craft, and helps really unify the craft more or less across Scotland. James I passes away, and the throne goes to his son Charles I. Now, Charles I got married to a Roman Catholic. Now, most of the Scots at this point in time are still pissed off at the Catholic Church, having felt defrauded over Catholic Church practices, policies, sale of indulgences, etc. So this creates animosity. Charles I, pledging in marriage to a Catholic bride, you know, becoming Catholic himself, a lot of native Scots felt that that was dangerous. Furthermore, Charles I did not aid the Continental Protestant forces during the 30 Years' War. And, ultimately, Charles I didn't try to play the Catholicism card and didn't try to actively promote it necessarily. He did try to force the Church of Scotland to adopt Anglican practices. That led to the Bishops' Wars and ultimately strengthened the English and Scottish parliaments, which helped, precipitate his own downfall. Ultimately, it led to the English Civil War. And after Charles I's defeat in 1645, he surrendered to, the Scottish force, freedom. And he was imprisoned in the Isle of Wight. Ultimately, the monarchy was restored, 15 years later with Charles's son, Charles II. Charles II went full Catholic. He attempted to introduce religious freedoms for Catholics, and the English Parliament actually forced him to withdraw the Royal Declaration of Indulgence, which was, really a push toward religious freedom. Charles is actually one of the most popular of the English kings, but he, when he passed away, he didn't have any legitimate children, and so he was succeeded by his brother James, who became James the Seventh in Scotland and James the Second in James the Second in England.
Is that King James from King James fame?
That is no, King James the First in England is the King James Bible
Okay.
fame. This is his grandson.
Okay.
So James the Second, and I promise we'll get to the Jacobites by the end of the show.
This is
We're
fascinating.
getting there. There's a lot to go through here. James II was yet another Catholic king, and ultimately it was thought that the Scots were okay with the throne passing to James's daughter, Mary, who was actually Protestant herself. The problem was in June of 1688, James's second wife had a son.
Oh.
So now Britain has to contend with the fact that there is the potential for a Catholic dynasty to take place. So a couple Protestant aristocrats hatched a little plan by sending a note to William of Orange so that they could remove James from power and replace him with his daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. And so William invaded and assumed the throne in what was known as the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary were crowned as co-monarchs in 1689, and that's when the trouble with the Jacobites started. So ultimately, the first Jacobite rebellion took place the very same year as the crowning of William and Mary, in 89. The primary instigator was a soldier who was Viscount Dundee. His name is John Graham. He was very loyal to the Stuarts, and that was the Charles James dynasty. as opposed to, the William of Orange dynasty. So Dundee rallied a rebel army largely composed of Scots, and they faced off against William's troops. On 27 July 1689, the Jacobites pulled off an amazing victory, and eventually really won that day. However, Dundee ended up dying on the field of battle, and that was a massive, massive blow to the morale of the Jacobite rebellion, to the point where they had further battles in 1689 and 1690, but the Jacobites were defeated both times, and so they ended up fading away for several years after that. So James II, who again was deposed in favor of William and Mary, died in exile in 1701. When William of Orange died in 1702, he was succeeded by his sister-in-law, Anne. When Anne died in 1714, everybody said, hey, we need to keep this line Protestant. We can't have the Catholics have it anymore. So the crown ended up actually passing to Anne's closest Protestant relative, George I of Hanover. And so this is the Hanover line of the British monarchy at this point in time. Now, George I was able to achieve something that really didn't sit well with the Scots, and that was the unification of England and Scotland officially. So since about 1603, England and Scotland shared a monarch. This is when James VI in Scotland, James I in England, same person. James essentially inherited the English throne from his cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. So since 1603, now for the past 100 years or so, 98 years to be exact, England and Scotland were separate countries, but they shared a monarch. In 1707, the Acts of Union officially united England and Scotland. This angered a lot of the Scots, and they fought to reclaim the throne for the current Stuart claimant, James II's son, James Edward Stuart. A lot of Jameses in this story.
Was that where Mel Gibson got involved, or was that before that?
I thought that Mel Gibson I believe Mel Gibson got involved, and I haven't watched Braveheart in a really long time, with the deposition of Charles I in 1645.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Continue.
So someone on YouTube fact check me on that, because I'm interested. So, first Jacobite rebellion wraps up in 1689. About 17 or 18 years later, England and Scotland reunite, and the Jacobites rise up again, this time in favor of James II's son, James Edward Stuart. This next major uprising of the came in 1750. At the time, there was John Erskine, who was the Earl of Mar, raised another rebellion with Scots, who took over several locations in Scotland, and ended up clashing with the British forces at the Battle of Sheriffmuir on 13 November 1715. This rebellion became known as the 15, but ultimately, after this battle and others, it fizzled out because the Earl of Mar ended up proving himself to be a very ineffective leader. So that was 1715. Fast forward now 30 years later to 1745. In 1745, James Edward Stuart's son, So now the next kid wants to get a shot at the throne. James Edward Stuart's son, Charles Edward Lewis, John Casimir Sylvester Severino Maria Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, decided to take the throne. Bonnie Prince Charlie arrived on the island of Eriskay in July of 1745, accompanied by a tiny contingent of followers. By September, he had actually raised enough support among the Scots to march into Edinburgh, and he began to lead the Jacobite forces to victory against government troops in several battles. Ultimately, the Jacobite army eventually crossed over into England. The problem was while Bonnie Prince Charlie had a lot of support and enjoyed a lot of support in Scotland, he did not enjoy the same support, in England. And so ultimately there was lack of support from England, lack of assistance from France, and Stuart eventually, Bonnie Prince Charlie had to eventually make his way back to Scotland. Ultimately, this Jacobite rebellion came to a head on 16 April 1746 at the Battle of Culloden. At that point, his forces just absolutely clashed with George's forces and were utterly obliterated and destroyed. At this point in time, Bonnie Prince Charlie lived, but he ended up living as a fugitive for several months before finally escaping back to Europe. And he ended up passing away in exile in 1788. And at this point in time, with the passing of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Jacobite cause really fizzled out for good and ceased to be a political threat. It's still very popular in Scotland, though, and it's highly mythologized by Victorian writers and in Scottish folklore.
We love to idolize our historical figures for sure.
We love
our tragic
romanticism.
heroes.
Yeah. So thank you for recapping that, because
I carried the show for 30 minutes.
I love it. Yes.
I'm gonna go to bed.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
But wait, there's more.
There's more.
Because what I find fascinating is that you've really set the political stage of what's going on in Europe
and religious,
right, in Scotland, Ireland, and England at this time frame, which is completely underpinning everything that's going on at the Premier Grand Lodge of England, right? So, when you said went all the way up to the birth of the daughter, right, and now there's this big fight from of trying to regain the throne to claim it as a Stuart from basically the founding of the Premier Grand Lodge of England in 1717 ish
2 years after the Jacobite rebellion of the 15th.
Right. And then you also have all the way up to the Jacobite rebellion in 1745 time frame. So you've got this period of 20 years or so that Freemasonry is hitting the ground running, right? It's going through its evolutions and revolutions. It's expanding across the other territories to include Ireland and Scotland. And then there's also a huge push of Masonry out toward France, for example. And so the theory becomes one that while this was a political battle, was this also happening at the same time inside of Masonic lodges? In other words, were there Jacobite Masons that were trying to use the cover of a Masonic lodge so that they could talk in secret to, grow their cause and hopefully one day overturn the throne? So one of the many myths attributed to Jacobite Masonry is that very shortly after the founding of the Premier Grand Lodge of England was that there was a huge notice of what else is going on in the country at this time, and so it is said, I can't find the specific source, I'm sure someone else will track that down for me too, that this is where we get the concept of not discussing religion and politics in the lodge room, because if you're starting this, if you start this this grand new experiment of a fraternity, that has these ideals, and then you're immediately seeing people start to populate this this great fraternity with religion and politics, you're like, guys, you're missing the point. We need to reset that.
There's a bigger underpinning too that we can't ignore, and that is at the forming of the Premier Grand Lodge of England and up until the formation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736, especially in Scotland, where the Jacobites were strong, you had this kind of butting up of heads between operative guild masons and the new speculative masons. And so throughout, starting in about 1600 with William Shaw, you start seeing, speculative and operative, or speculative masons starting to show up on the log rosters or on the rosters. But after the foundation of the Premier Grand Lodge of England in 1717-ish, there's a huge explosive growth of lodges and charters and speculative masonry. Formation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland was partially in response to the explosion of speculative Freemasonry within England. And so now not only do you have the Catholicism versus Protestantism, you now have Catholic stonemasons fighting, butting heads against potentially Protestant speculative Freemasons. And it's all coming to a head all at once around the same time as these Jacobite uprisings. You guys look like something smells bad.
No, so I had a couple just in the the time that you were carrying us all talking. I had a couple of comments.
Arms are so heavy.
I know. Just a couple of quick comments. I mean, I think the history books and us living in the United States and in modern society, we kind of gloss over this fact, but the religious wars in the UK and in the rest of Europe, like, they were no BS. Like, it wasn't just like, I would say it's similar to a lot of the different Islamic sects that are out there. I mean, they fight for blood and for no holds barred. Is like, it wasn't just happy go lucky time in Europe, especially in the United Kingdom, or what would be the United Kingdom. Catholicism versus Protestantism was bloody, and it raged for hundreds of years. And to fact check you before, William Wallace was in 1307. So that's when Edward I was King of England. But I mean, they were raging about that kind of stuff back then. So these religious wars that Jason's been talking about,
by 400 years,
300 years, yeah.
It's cool.
I mean,
think about Rob Roy. Rob Roy was like Braveheart Part 2.
Ooh. I dig it.
So apologize for the mischaracterization of William Wallace.
We can fix it later. Don't worry about it.
We'll fix it in post.
Edit it in post.
We'll fix it in post, yes. Oh, but the point I was going to make was, outside of that, was I find it really interesting that a lot of the stuff that we had to read for today's episode really starts to talk about the fundamental differences between Jacobite Masonry and, I guess, what they call Hanoverian Masonry. And just to touch on what John said a little bit, I mean, yeah, the Premier Grand Lodge was formed in 1717-ish, but there were absolutely speculative lodges in England before then. As we know, they had to form. But there were some, we have records of earlier lodges that were composed primarily of speculative Masons in the 1600s, especially in Scotland. And I know my Scottish brothers love to talk about how they have some of the oldest lodges in the world. But I mean, it does speak to how far speculative Masonry had been going on before England tried to form a Grand Lodge, and have an organizing body around that whole structure. So, and I think we'll probably get into this as the show goes on, but you read a lot of stuff recently that talks about how there really were two branches of Freemasonry. You had that Jacobite, which turned into Jacobite Tory Freemasonry versus Hanoverian and Whig Freemasonry in England. And it was divisive, and it was probably one of the reasons why we had a split in the Grand Lodge, a few years after it formed. So, just some things to keep in your head.
So then, if we're trying to now track down in history where there was some influence in the growing Masonic system of the Jacobites as influencing the mindset of Freemasonry, and so we're trying to now see if those politics and that religion did interweave with Freemasonry. Let's try to find that smoking gun. And so A.E. Waite, in his Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, does a good job trying to pull together, well, at least what was known at that time, and a lot of his findings are inconclusive, right? He tries to pull together some characteristics that may point to some alignment with Jacobitism in Freemasonry. One of which I find really fascinating is, let's go look at the Grand Masters of the Premier Grand Lodge of England. So if we have this, documented through Anderson's Constitutions and a couple other documents, where if you look at 1717, we had Anthony Sayer; 1718, George Payne; 1719, my boy John Desaguliers; 1720, we had George Payne; 1721 through 23, John Montague, the second Duke of Montague; and then finally in 1723. We had Philip Wharton, who was actually the Duke of Wharton, who was explicitly known to be a very proud Jacobist. So here we have the, 6th Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge of England during the height of everything we're talking about. And now we have a guy who is proudly a Jacobist.
And what year is this, John?
1723.
So there's a note here in one of these, in a paper that I was reading this morning regarding this, which just as a footnote, it said the Walsh family with Freemasonry has already been mentioned, and O'Hegarty is credited with membership of a group of Jacobites which founded the first native French Masonic Lodge in 1725. So like at this point in 1725, just 2 years later, you've got literally somebody who, is just putting out. Sorry, my dog's whining. 1725. Yeah, it's May. A Jacobite lodge. Essentially, right? But in a French.
Yeah, just 2 years later. Again, think of the expansion that's going to go on with Masonry as it's exploding. Yeah, it makes perfect sense that it could reach this French system and impact that, not only the French lodges, which we do know were actually chartered by some of these, the Grand Lodge of England at the time. And we also, may have a lot of alignment, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to the creation of the higher degrees, which also became the Ecosse Freemasonry or Scottish Rite.
Yeah, something too to remember is with like the Jacobite stuff, and I'm sure Jason covered all this when I was putting my kids to bed. Believing
you'll never know.
I'll have to listen in the post-production of the show. That they're obsessed with divine right to rule, and you see somebody who was pointing something out in terms of Freemasonry and the kind of juxtaposition that this had within the craft, because we view people on the level. So like this is a really big departure. It's almost like incompatible, yet they just go, well, there's enough of us, so we can do it. And the other part of it is that there is a French Jacobite connection too, but it's completely separate. And what people have tended to say about it is that the French Jacobite was essentially just the movement was just to push and make sure that the country was ruled under Catholicism. But we know how well that went over.
Catholic or Protestant, both bloody.
Yeah, and as a side, you guys will probably
got that little separate church and state in there, or separation of church and state.
Joe Wages actually talks a lot about the two things where we've got Protestant and Catholicism butting heads, and you have the creation of entire different rites, the Scots Master Degree and the Royal Arch kind of thing. So it's hairy.
Well, that's kind of the point, and that I think what brings it back to the Freemasonic point was you had different strands of speculative masonry rising during this time. You know what I mean? And I do know that we did talk about how some of it is very recent in terms of research, right? A lot of the things that I read talked about how I love my brothers in England, love ugly. But we're getting a lot of papers recently that talk about that a lot of the early history of Scottish Freemasonry is kind of hidden under the huge amounts of historical content that come out of England, right? Touting themselves as the first premier Grand Lodge and that kind of thing, and that we're missing some tidbits of information that could be there from Scotland, but it just doesn't get a lot of press. Don't know if that's 100% true or not. Jason's making a face. But what we do know is that you did have different political motivations for your different flavors of Freemasonry, especially in England during that time. Now, could that have left the shores of England and gone to other countries? Why not, right? Everything was so intertwined back then, exactly to the point we talked about earlier. Religious affiliation was so important back then, whether you were Catholic or you were Protestant. That really determined your life. So why would you not bring that into these new budding organizations of Masonic lodges that were performing speculative Freemasonry? And why would you not espouse that type of, I guess, nationalism, right? We do it here in America, right? I think every country that practices Freemasonry does insert some of their own nationalistic juices. That's a really weird description. Juices into their Freemasonry. Yeah. I'm not gonna say juices anymore. But don't put that on the bingo card. Masonic juices. Wow.
Moist masonry.
Oh, boo. Oh. Anywho,
I don't want to play anymore.
Well, you take a time out then, because we're talking about juices. So these juices of masonry that are, man, I think they really did color how Freemasonry expanded, and I don't think it's a stretch to talk about how some of that stuff may have made its way into France. And we know very early on, like RJ said, when you talk to guys like Joe Wages, who are very well read on the subject, French Freemasonry went totally different than your traditional UK Freemasonry very early on, and it had a lot of different symbolism. It had a lot of different stuff, some things that we miss, that we long for, but it was very different. So long story short, a lot of the stuff that's coming out recently is talking about how a lot of that Ecosse flavor of Freemasonry may have started in Scotland and had moved on to, France, where it just exploded.
So Scottish Rite was Scottish first. You heard it here first, folks.
I didn't say that, but okay.
It's literally what you said.
Yeah.
Fix it in post.
All right. And replace every time I say juices with fluids. That's better.
Not
Masonic
by much.
fluid.
Not by much.
No. Okay. Right on.
No.
So go ahead, RJ.
This is kind of just, there's so much that this covers because it's really like a historical kind of an influence tale, and things go in every which direction, and you end up with like factions of people that are connected and then not connected, and this whole nationalistic ties. Something that just kind of popped in my head as we were talking about this today and reading about it was a few years ago. Somebody had actually written an article for the Midnight Freemasons, and it was called the Blue and the Orange, Freemasonry and the Orange Order. And this article got a lot of runaround because if anybody who is unfamiliar, the Orange Order is essentially an order that formed and took its name after William Orange. Is that, yeah? So he
William of Orange.
William of Orange. Thank you.
Orange because he was Dutch.
Yeah. So what's interesting is you've got people, the Jacobites, back William of Orange. I'm sorry, they don't like him, right? And then you have people who are still loyal to James, and then there's an attempt on William of Orange's life, and then eventually he dies or whatever. And there's this connection to this Orange Order that exists today, and I think it's just wild. And they have a Grand Lodge. And if I could just read this little blurb at the bottom of this article, because I thought it was just pertinent for today. It says these fraternities have followed after the Masonic model as the oldest and most successful paradigm of fraternalism that exists. And it goes on to say, it says, but beyond this, the cosmetic similarity discussed earlier, Freemasonry and Orangism are chalk and cheese. One promotes the universal brotherhood of man for the betterment of all mankind and advances beautiful systems of morality to achieve that end, while the other promotes militant loyalism and maintains deep connections with loyalist parliamentary groups with whom they promote sectarian violence. For proof of this, one need look
Wait, which
no
is
further.
Freemasonry?
One need look no further than the Orange Marches, which pass unnecessarily through the Catholic areas of Northern Ireland. These marches, more often than not, lead to violence. So I was curious about this, and I looked up Orange Marches, and sure enough, even into 2021, it is a huge thing. It is like racist ideologies and all of this wild stuff that's super...
Yikes.
I mean, it's crazy, right? So it's just wild to me, though, because this kind of thing is born out of the same time period is the Jacobite uprisings, and it's all connected, and it's really one of maybe the only things that has a loose connection to this today.
So Joe, I want you to get to your section about Jacobite inventions in a second here.
Okay.
But before you do, there was another interesting linkage/theory about the Jacobite influence as far as a division of Masonry. So around 1813, what's a really big division that happened in Freemasonry? Anyone? Like an ancient and modern split, perhaps? Right. So what was going on there is that it's been assumed that, or alleged, that's probably a better term, alleged that the ancients and modern splits was actually influenced by that. So much, in fact, that AEWA calls it out, that within recent years it's been advanced that the ancients' Grand Lodge was the Masonry of the Catholics and the Stuarts, while that of the moderns was Protestant and Hanoverian. But he says there's not a particle of real evidence to support that claim. But it's interesting to think about.
You know what? I would be a bajillionaire if I did what some of these bros did and put 3 pages of stuff on and said, I could say that, aliens came down and gave us the square and compass and everything is magical. But there's no corroborating evidence to support this. I just needed to fill a page in my encyclopedia. Like,
Maybe.
I would be a trillionaire by now because I hate that.
So there is one piece of recent research that makes that loose tie just a little bit less loose, which is that the chief organizer and the ideologue of the ancients was one Lawrence Dermot, who was almost certainly of the Jacobite-connected MacDermot family of Strokeston, Roscommon. It is also noteworthy that both the Irish and Scottish Grand Lodges continue to regard themselves as closer to the ancients than the official English Grand Lodge at that time. So, it's circumstantial evidence, not causal evidence at that point, right? But if it kind of smells, like a Jacobite, maybe, I don't know. So, what have you got, Joe? Fluids and smells.
I don't even know anymore. Well, we're not going to talk about juices anymore. And just a little tidbit on what Robert was talking about with the Orange Order. When I grew up in New York, New York is my area of New York was very either Roman Catholic or Jewish. Like, that was my whole neighborhood. There was nothing in between. I didn't know what a Christian was until I left New York. But I remember a couple of my friends' dads were part of the Orange Order, super fiercely Protestant. And I had to look this up later. If you were a member of the Orange Order and you married a non-Protestant, you would be expelled. So,
yikes.
Y'all complain about our requirements to become a member. It gets hairy. But anywho, so one of the things that Waite wrote about was Jacobite inventions. And he kind of coins this term talking about things that Jacobites invented to, I guess, have legitimacy to their myths and legends. But, one thing was that there was, Jacobite Rose-Croix lodges, I guess you could call them, before that even became a term. And again, Waite also says, I don't have any evidence of this, but, it's a cool story. But he does say one cool thing, which again is pretty and romanticized, but he writes about being a Jacobite invention is that Jacobite Freemasonry, as their symbolism, had a cubic stone, and that represented the House of Stuart. And that overthrown altars indicated, so I guess it's part of their seal or their logo, indicated that the House of Stuart was in exile, while their restoration meant that the royal house was reinstated, which it never really happened, right? But, I think Waite calls it a cheap and tawdry explanation of holy symbolism. So I guess he wasn't a fan of that. And I think we know Waite was an American, but he was British, of British lineage. So which way he went with things in his encyclopedia. But I thought that was kind of neat.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the last little tidbit of information before we start to round it up for the final question is, there is, again, when we talk about the potential Jacobite influence towards the East, going towards France and French lodges, and then, as we know, there's this growth of the Écossais movement, the higher degrees. There is some speculation of, was the Jacobite Catholic influence part of what grew to basically become the Scottish degree system that we have today, or at least from an very early standpoint. And but the problem with that story is that the dates don't line up, right? So when we're talking again, the huge Jacobite uprising in 1745, and they kind of got their butts kicked, and that was really kind of the end of it. You still had a couple people that were loyalists, but they really died out after that. That was kind of the final battle. And yet the the history of the higher degrees of Freemasonry really start to not to show up until at least documented, really don't show up until like the 1740, what we got, 1744, where we have the book Les Parfaits Masons, published in 1744, where they actually talk about uh, French lodges that are actually conferring higher degrees or additional degrees, right, which lead to the Scotch degrees. That really at this point there's not a clear connection timeline wise, because really it's the last hurrah for the Jacobites, whereas the higher degree system is really just starting to evolve right then. You could say there's a connection there, but it's another loose one. So I just wanted to bring that up because people have tried to link other things like, well, Jacobites were in Scotland and the Knights Templar degrees came from Scotland. Like, okay, so like that's it's another weak connection that really doesn't have a lot of historical evidence to support that up.
Well, it's because they went to hide there, and then they went to Oak Island, and then boom.
That was it. That was the link. I totally missed it. Final thoughts. Here we go. The final question.
And they were descendant from the Templars, who went and hid in Roslyn Chapel.
Obviously. with the Holy Grail.
Can we do an episode on the origins of craft masonry, like a debate episode?
Ooh, I like it.
I'm gonna lose.
Yeah, the Ancient Aliens
we had
one.
Done one of those.
I go for the weird stuff, man.
Back in the day.
I want to debate.
Round two. Ooh, okay. Oh, I like a debate.
Whether Masonry came out of the Templars or not.
So there's the ancient mysticism theory. There is the Templar theory. There is the British Supper Club response theory, and then there is the operative evolutionary theory that I personally ascribe to.
You forgot the Ancient Aliens theory. So anyway, yeah. So let's get to the final question. So this one should be an easy one for all of you. The final question is there an overt Jacobite influence to Freemasonry, either in the past or in the present? And we'll start with our resident historian, Jason Richards.
The answer is none that can be corroborated through historical record. I would imagine that if there were an overt influence, hold on.
I think that's a sneeze.
Did you know that's allergy season? Now you do. If there were an overt influence, we would have more historical records to that effect, especially given how records focused craft lodges were in the early 1700s. Really starting with 1600, that's really where you see lodges keeping detailed records. And if those records have not surfaced, kind of linking Jacobitism and Freemasonry, then to me it's very unlikely that the two are connected in any official capacity.
Says our local historian. Thank you, Jason, for bringing that up. And thank you again for the fantastic short version of European history for a couple 300, 400 years. So thanks again. Robert, what say you? What's the Jacobite influence to Freemasonry?
Maybe the only influence that remains is like an element of cronyism. There's certainly some of that goes on. The basic Jacobite belief of God-appointed rulers, God-appointed monarchies, kind of is echoed a little bit in the way Freemasonry has its structure. Certainly, we all say things like, we're all brother. But I think John and Jason, you guys were the people who made me laugh my butt off the first time you said, everybody's on the level. That's why there's so many. So in that same respect, right? There is a divine right to control the fraternity, by a Grand Master and its subordinate line of officers. And maybe that's the only tie that you could find, but it's not actually a tie, right? It's just a similarity between the two, and loose one at that. So Jacobitism and Freemasonry, no thanks. As I mentioned in our green room chat that we all have, I said, this is kind of an interesting topic. We get hung up on the history because literally, Masonically speaking, there's nothing. Waite is by far probably the only one who mentions anything of note, and even he's kind of like, I don't know,
Meh.
right? So, yeah, that's all I got. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, Joe, was there a Jacobite influence to Freemasonry? Yes or no?
Was there? I mean, probably, at least for the time that you had Jacobites who were Freemasons, and they gathered together. I mean, I will agree with my illustrious co-hosts that there probably is little, if any, commingling of juices today. I got it in one more time.
Overt commingling of juices.
Wow, that's so bad.
We're going to lose our rating for this.
I don't think there's any, I'm sorry, I'll use a different word. I don't think there's any Jacobite fluids in modern Freemasonry today.
It doesn't make it better.
You're not helping. You're highlighting it. So anyway, I don't think so. Not very much. Jacobites, sorry, you guys lost. And boom. Happy St. Patty's Day.
Woo. Awesome.
Woo!
So Jacobite influence in Freemasonry, of course there were, because there were Catholics that were Freemasons at the time, right? So, even today, we're living with taking the politics and religion out of Lodge, and then yet we're still humans that have to deal with politics and religion outside of Lodge. And so to say that there wasn't any even implied influence, right, this is to be naive. That we bring who we are into the Lodge experience. And so while we don't have any good evidence, as stated by Waite and others who've done the research, of explicit Jacobite influence to change the direction of Freemasonry, it's not to say that there weren't Jacobites who were Freemasons. We know our 6th Grand Master was, and and he really wasn't all that upstanding of a person, to be honest. If you look at Philip Wharton, his background, he was a drunk and just kind of partied a little too hard. But either way, it was a fascinating place to research. I think the evidence isn't there, but it certainly makes for a good story, and that's the way a lot of Masonic myths start out, as great stories that are just that, and that will remain a part of our history, whether it's true or not. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and keep searching for more light. Have a good night.